My name is Fiona. I'm 38 years old, a licensed occupational therapist working out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I spent 7 years of my life convinced that the reason my marriage was falling apart was because my body had failed us both. The morning everything ended, my husband walked into the kitchen while I was measuring out my progesterone supplements, the ones my fertility specialist in Dartmouth had me taking twice a day, and he set a manila envelope on the counter without saying a word. I looked at him. He looked at the envelope. I picked it up. Divorce papers. I remember the sound of the supplement bottle hitting the tile floor. I didn't pick it up. I just stood there in my own kitchen in my bathrobe at 7 in the morning, holding a document that told me my husband of 7 years wanted out. We've been trying for 4 years, I finally said. We just finished the second round of UE. He crossed his arms. The results aren't going to be different this time, Fiona. I asked him what he meant by that. He said I knew exactly what he meant. He said he'd been patient. He said he'd given me time. He said the words slowly and carefully like he'd rehearsed them, and what he was really saying underneath all of it was that he blamed me. That my body was the problem. That I was the problem. His name is Callum. He's a commercial real estate developer. We met when I was 30 and he was 35 at a mutual friend's dinner party in downtown Halifax, and for the first 2 years he made me feel like I was the most important person in any room he walked into. By year 4, I'd started to wonder if I was wrong about that. By year 6, I knew I was. He moved out of our house in Bedford that same week. He'd apparently already arranged everything. His brother picked up his things in a rented cargo van on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. I came home to half-empty closets and the faint smell of his cologne fading out of the bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I didn't cry. I think I was too tired to cry. 4 years of fertility appointments and blood draws and procedures that left me lying on paper-covered tables staring at fluorescent ceiling lights. I was just tired. The house was mine, legally. I'd put down most of the deposit from money my mother left me when she passed. Callum knew that. His lawyer knew that. But he still had his name on the mortgage we'd refinanced 2 years in, and the first thing his lawyer did was file to freeze our joint accounts while the division of assets was being sorted out. I had my personal checking account. I had my salary from the clinic. I had the house. What I didn't have was any idea what came next. My neighbor had lived in the house to the left of mine for about 2 years before I actually spoke to him properly. I'd seen him, of course. Hard not to notice a man that tall clearing his driveway at 6 in the morning, or hauling what appeared to be a very large dog kennel out of a pickup truck by himself. I knew his first name was Reed because I'd signed for a package of his once, and I knew he worked odd hours because sometimes his lights were on at 4 in the morning, and sometimes his truck was gone for 3 days straight. My mother's friend Greta, who lived 2 streets over and knew everything about everyone in a 5-kilometer radius, told me he was a retired RCMP investigator. Retired young, she said, with a meaningful look I didn't know how to interpret at the time. The first time we actually talked, really talked, was about 3 weeks after Callum left. It was late October, and I was outside trying to get our old garden shed door to close properly because the latch had rusted, and I hadn't gotten around to calling anyone, and I was standing in the cold in a university sweatshirt getting increasingly frustrated, and Reed came around the corner of his fence and said, "That one needs a new strike plate. I've got one in the garage if you want it." I probably looked terrible. I hadn't been sleeping. I said yes anyway. He fixed the latch in about 12 minutes. He didn't ask me anything personal. He didn't comment on the half-cleared garden beds or the recycling that had been sitting by the door for a week. He just fixed the latch and said to let him know if anything else needed looking at. I thought about that conversation a lot over the next few months, the not asking, the just doing. The divorce proceedings dragged through the winter the way these things do in Nova Scotia, slowly, expensively, with a lot of waiting. Callum's lawyer contested the asset split twice. My lawyer, a very steady woman named Joanne who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, sent me calm and thorough emails explaining each development. I signed things. I attended a mediation session in a beige office building on Barrington Street where Callum sat across the table from me and didn't make eye contact once. I drove home afterward and made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. It was during those months that I found out, through Greta's particular talent for information, that Reed had separated from his wife about a year before he moved to Bedford. No children. She'd relocated to British Columbia. Greta said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, and then changed the subject to her daughter's new job in Toronto. I didn't do anything with that information. I wasn't in any state to do anything with it. I was trying to keep my patient caseload manageable, maintain my billing hours so my clinic income stayed stable, and not fall apart in the grocery store, which I came close to doing twice, both times in the soup aisle, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear to me. What I didn't expect was that Reed would start leaving things on my porch, not romantic things, practical things. A bag of calcium chloride for the ice patch at the bottom of my front steps, a note saying the city was accepting winter tire rebate applications until the end of February. Once, a small potted rosemary plant with a piece of masking tape on the pot that said kitchen herb, low maintenance. I left a container of butter tarts on his porch after that. It felt like the right response. By January, I was seeing my family doctor for the fatigue that had been dragging at me since September. She ordered blood work as she always did, thorough and careful. I went back 2 weeks later for the results. I sat in the chair across from her desk, and she looked at me over her reading glasses and said something I genuinely did not expect. I was pregnant, not from EUI, not from any intervention. The timing, she said, was about 12 weeks back, late September, early October. The dates that made no clinical sense to me whatsoever, given that Callum and I hadn't been physically close in months before he left. I drove home in a state of complete disbelief. I sat in the driveway for 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard, thinking if I just waited long enough, the information would settle into something I could understand. I had been so convinced, so thoroughly convinced, after 4 years of appointments and blood work and failed procedures, that the problem was mine. My body. My failure. Callum had never been tested, not properly, because he'd refused twice and I'd stopped pushing. His fertility specialist had flagged it. I'd mentioned it to Callum. He'd said the numbers from his initial screening were fine and that was the end of it. The thing was, this pregnancy hadn't happened with Callum. There was only one explanation for when it had happened, and the explanation was the tall, quiet man next door who had fixed my shed latch and left rosemary on my front steps. Reed and I had spent one evening in late September talking on his back deck until past midnight. His dog, a large gray shepherd named Fig, sprawled between us on the boards. One thing had led to another in the quietly inevitable way of two lonely adults in their late 30s on a cool September night. I'd thought about it afterward. I'd told myself it was a one-time thing, a kindness between neighbors, and left it at that. I stood on his porch the next evening with my coat half-buttoned and knocked on his door. He opened it, read my face, and said, "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." That was Reed. He always knew when a kettle was what the situation needed. I told him. He sat quietly for a moment, both hands around his mug, and then he said, "Okay," not as a dismissal, as an acceptance. Like I'd told him something true and he was making room for it. "I'm not asking you for anything," I said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's not the point." We talked for 2 hours. He was measured and honest and didn't pretend the situation wasn't complicated. He also didn't make me feel like a problem he needed to manage. By the time I left, something had shifted between us in a way that I couldn't fully articulate but could feel quite clearly. The divorce was finalized in March. Joanne had worked a clean settlement. I kept the house outright. Callum received a cash buyout from our joint investment account that reflected his actual financial contributions, and our joint accounts were dissolved and distributed. He signed without contesting the final terms, which surprised me until Joanne mentioned, with the particular neutrality of a very professional lawyer, that his circumstances had apparently changed, and a prolonged process was no longer in his interest. I found out later, through Greta naturally, that the woman Callum had been seeing since before he served me papers, a junior associate at a competing development firm, had ended things with him in February. Callum had apparently been under the impression that she was expecting his child. She was not. The child she was expecting had a different father entirely. He had been, by all accounts, blindsided. I didn't feel good about that exactly, but I didn't feel bad about it either. By the time the snow started melting off the backyard in April, I was visibly pregnant, and Reed and I had settled into something I didn't have a clean word for, not quite together, not apart. Somewhere in the careful and honest middle ground of two people who'd been hurt before, and were taking things at a pace they'd both agreed on. He came over for dinner most Wednesdays. We walked Fig through the neighborhood on weekends. He attended the 20-week ultrasound with me, at my invitation, sitting in the chair beside the table with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the screen. And when the technician moved the wand, and the two distinct heartbeats resolved into two distinct shapes, Reed made a sound I had never heard from him before, a short, slightly strangled exhale of absolute surprise. Twins. The technician smiled at both of us. Reed reached over and took my hand and I let him. I was 38 years old, 7 years past the beginning of a marriage that had quietly dismantled me piece by piece. I was sitting in a clinic in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia in April, holding the hand of a man who had fixed my shed latch and left rosemary on my steps and said, "Okay," like it was the simplest word in the world, and the screen in front of me showed two small, completely improbable, entirely real human beings. That was the moment something in my chest finally unclenched. The summer was busy in the practical way that second trimesters tend to be. I converted the spare bedroom. Reed built the crib. He'd ordered the parts himself, showed up on a Saturday morning with a coffee for me and a toolbox, and had the thing assembled by noon while Fig supervised from the doorway. I increased my sessions with my therapist, Dr. Amara, who had been helping me process the years of fertility grief that I hadn't realized had accumulated into something quite heavy until I started actually putting words to it. "You spent years believing your body had failed," she said one afternoon. "And then your body did the thing on its own terms, on its own timeline." That was something I needed to sit with for a while. The clinic gave me a longer parental leave than I'd expected because my case supervisor had quietly advocated for it, which I only found out afterward. My patients were redistributed to 2 colleagues for the duration. I had my professional liability insurance, my employment insurance benefits, and my savings, which were modest but adequate. I had drawn up a budget with help from my financial planner, a practical man named Kevin who wore the same cardigan every time I saw him and whom I trusted completely, and the numbers worked. Not comfortably, but they worked. What I had not expected was for Callum to contact me in August. He sent a message through Joanne's office. His lawyer had apparently suggested this rather than reaching out to me directly, to ask if we could speak. Joanne called me and read me the request in her measured way and then said, "You're under no obligation, whatever you prefer." I thought about it for 2 days. Then I said yes, not for him, because I wanted to be the kind of person who could sit in a room with someone who had hurt them and not need anything from it. We met at a coffee shop in Dartmouth on a Tuesday morning. He looked tired. His tie was slightly crooked in a way the Callum I'd been married to would never have allowed. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. He said he'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I was expecting. He said he wasn't sure what he'd thought that conversation would look like, but he wanted to acknowledge that he'd handled things badly. He said the words carefully, like they'd cost him something to prepare. I waited until he was done. Then I said, "I know." He looked at me. "I've had a lot of time to be angry," I said, "and a lot of time to not be. I spent 7 years thinking I was the reason we couldn't have children. I want you to understand that I know now that wasn't true." He was very quiet for a moment. He said there were results from a test I had done later. After we separated, he paused. "They weren't what I'd thought they were." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I'd already worked out the arithmetic. I told him I hoped he found whatever he was looking for. I meant it, not warmly but honestly. I drove home with all 4 windows down even though it was only 15 degrees out, because I needed the air. Our daughters were born in November, 3 weeks early, which my OB had anticipated and prepared for. They arrived in the gray early morning hours at the IWK Health Center in Halifax, 5 pounds 3 ounces and 5 pounds 1 ounce, respectively, pink and furious and absolutely perfect. Reed was there. He held my hand through the part that needed hand-holding and stayed very calmly out of the way through the parts that needed the nurses', which is exactly right. When they placed the second one in his arms, he looked down at her with an expression I don't have words adequate enough to describe, and I thought, there it is. There is the thing I didn't know I was waiting for. We named them after my mother's mother and Reed's grandmother, Cecily and June. Reed moved in properly in the spring after we'd talked it through the way we talked everything through. Carefully, honestly, without rushing to conclusions. He listed his own house and sold it within a month to a young couple from Ontario who'd moved to Halifax during the pandemic and decided to stay. He brought Fig, obviously. Fig adapted to the babies with the dignified patience of a very large, very elderly dog who had decided to simply accept whatever life presented. The house that I'd almost lost in the asset division, the house my mother's money had built a life in, became something different, louder, more complicated, better. I went back to work part-time in June, 2 days a week to start, with my case supervisor's full support. My patients had been well cared for by my colleagues and the handoff back was smooth. I sat across from a new patient on my first day back, a woman in her mid-40s who had been referred for rehabilitation support after a long hospitalization, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be doing exactly the work I was supposed to be doing. That's not a small thing. I didn't know how small I'd gotten inside the years of waiting and hoping and being told to be patient. I didn't know how much of myself I'd handed over to the idea that I was failing. You don't always see it happening. You just look up one day and realize the person you were has gotten very quiet, and you're not sure when that started. I know when mine started coming back. It was October, a latch on a garden shed, and a man who didn't ask questions and didn't comment on the recycling, and just did the thing that needed doing. Reed and I got married the following September, small ceremony, our backyard, Greta in the front row in a remarkable hat, Cecily and June in matching linen dresses that they were both philosophically opposed to, Fig wearing a bow tie that lasted approximately 11 minutes before June removed it with the focused determination of a 10-month-old who has decided something is over. My lawyer Joanne sent flowers. My therapist Dr. Amara sent a card with a line in it I've thought about since. You didn't survive this. You rebuilt. That's the truest thing anyone has said to me about the last few years. We didn't survive, we rebuilt. With Rosemary on the porch steps and two small humans who arrived on their own terms at 5 in the morning in November, and a gray dog named Fig who adjusted to everything with grace, and a man who still makes tea when the situation calls for it, which is, it turns out, more often than you'd think.